When my mom divorced my stepdad, we had to move out of the house I grew up in and into some income-based housing in the city. This was during the summer before my first year of college, and I worked at a nearby gas station to make money to take with me to school. I had worked there in high school too, and it was a roughish part of town, and there was a lot of low-income/homeless people cashing in their change for beer. I think this made me a little unfazed of sketchy people. During the first week after moving in, I went to make myself some SpaghettiOs for lunch, but realized we didn't have a can opener since we had moved. I figured one of my neighbors might let me borrow one and left my apartment to find out. Toward the front of my building, there was a dude sitting on his patio in a lawn chair drinking a beer. I greeted him, told him that I had just moved in and asked if I could borrow a can opener. He seemed really friendly, if sketchy, and excited to help, but he also kept making weird comments about a son he had that was my age and how cute we would be together. He insisted I meet his son and tried to get me to come inside to meet him, and to get me the can opener, of course. I was naive, not stupid, but I really wanted my food, so I agreed to wait at the door and say hello while he grabbed the can opener for me. It was kind of weird, but I met his kid, borrowed the can opener, and life went on. Except now they knew me. I had to walk by their apartment to get into mine, and they were always sitting out there, drinking, smoking, and yelling, and they often greeted me. I was polite, but not warm to them. We knew each other. One day, my boyfriend at the time and I had bought a bunch of groceries to make dinner. Everything was in paper grocery bags, so my boyfriend put them in a box that he had in his trunk to get everything in one trip. As we got out of the car, I heard my sketchy acquaintances yelling, but they did that often, and when I glanced, I noticed there was a young child riding a bike in the road in front of their place. I assumed he was yelling at the kid to get out of the road, and paid no attention. As my boyfriend Tyler and I crossed the parking lot and started walking towards my apartment, suddenly the dude came running at us. He was yelling about us coming into his turf and paying tribute. I didn't even notice the knife until he held it to Tyler's face. He seemed to think that we owed him money, and he was pissed about our groceries for some reason. He kept threatening to cut us and send a message. Luckily, Tyler was super level-headed and just kept talking calmly to him. Tyler kept explaining, "It's just groceries, man. We don't want any trouble. I don't know what you're talking about." The guy was just getting more and more angry at this, and he kept getting louder and gesturing with his knife to make his point. Tyler was holding the box with both hands, so he couldn't defend himself. I was completely frozen and sure that I was going to die. In all, this probably went on for 3 to 5 minutes, but it seemed like forever. Finally, another neighbor came out on his porch and yelled at the guy, "Cut that shit out, man. I got kids and shit. Those are kids, man. Chill the fuck out." The guy did not put his knife down, but the yelling between them did call out the guy's kids. They ran out and grabbed him and pulled him back into the house. They shouted at us, "Get away from him!" Gladly. And they didn't want any trouble, and their dad didn't mean anything. Meanwhile, he is fighting them to come and stab us and yelling about how he is going to get us, and we better have his money. As soon as the knife was a safe distance from Tyler's chest and stomach area, we ran to my apartment and immediately called my mom, who called the police and rushed home from work. The police came and took statements. Apparently this guy had a record of dealing drugs and other crimes. They told us that maybe the guy thought we were selling on his turf. Box full of groceries equal meth supplies. Anyway, they arrested him. My mom was outside our house talking to the cops when they pulled this guy out of his house. His kids were screaming and following the cops, and they all saw my mom. The kids started screaming at her, telling her that she was a fucking uppity cunt, and threatening to beat the shit out of her. My mom doesn't take crap from anyone, so she was very classily yelling back that she would kill any motherfucker that threatened her kid, and calling them white trash junkie welfare rats. The cops were trying to intervene and disperse everyone to their apartments. As they pulled the guy away towards the cop car, he screamed at my mom, "I'm going to have my people pay you a visit real soon. You think you're tough? Let's see you kill those motherfuckers I sent through that window for you and your little girl. Sleep tight, bitch. They're coming for you. I know people." And they put him in the cop car, and everything was quiet. Tyler went home, and we didn't see each other very many times after that. I later learned he was involved in some sketchy stuff, so maybe they did know each other, or have a beef somehow. I'm still thankful for the way he handled everything, though. We got a restraining order, and never saw the family again, which is pretty weird considering how close we all lived. I was really freaked out for about a month or so, worried that people were going to break into our house and rape and kill us. Then one day he came into my work while I was on the counter. My coworkers knew about the incident, so when I told them, "That's him," they let me go hide. I thought he had come for me, but he just bought beer and cigarettes. As he left, I moved, and he saw me, but he didn't know who I was. He didn't recognize me at all. I'm not sure he even remembered the near stabbing. It was surprisingly comforting. I went off to college, and the family was evicted for too many police responses in the area. He later went to jail for unrelated charges. Before I get into narrating this story, I wanted to make a quick note. This is a story I've actually been sitting on for a few months. It got submitted a while ago, but it gets pretty gruesome, and it's a little out there, so I wasn't quite sure how people would respond, or if I should technically call it true, even though it could be, it's just really far out there. I don't know, this is just one of those stories. Either way, I figured I'd show true transparency and give you a little insight on my end. Hope you enjoy it regardless. I'm a 17-year-old male, and this happened to me a few days ago, whilst I was home alone. I live virtually in the middle of absolutely nowhere, with the nearest neighbor and police station being around half an hour away from me, as my parents decided to soak up the country air and atmosphere, which could be enjoyed. My house is 3 stories high, and my bedroom is the top right window if you were looking at my house from the front, and my garden leads into a set of woods, which is about 10 miles long. To get to the woods, I would have to go into my garden and walk for around 5 minutes, and from there I would have to hop a little fence, and then I'd be in. And to be honest, when it's dark, that set of woods really creeps me out. My parents and younger brother were on holiday in Corsica to soak up the sun and go sightseeing, as Corsica has some beautiful views and a lovely atmosphere. I couldn't go, as I was working every day, so that I could earn an extra $1 or $2. I had cooked some spaghetti and meatballs, which Mom left me the day before, and all was going well. The bass was booming, and the house was in good form. I had a couple of beers, and ate my dinner. The thing that was weird was that I couldn't shake off this feeling of being watched, which I can't say I had experienced before. I brushed it off as paranoia, as it was dark, since it was around 11 p.m. However, this feeling stayed with me, and it would not leave me. Eventually, I turned off the speakers and all of the downstairs lights. I locked all the doors and windows and made my way to bed, and browsed Reddit and Spotify for about an hour. The house was silent as I was surfing the web, which was expected. That was when I heard something or someone walking into my drive. My drive is made from gravel, so I could easily hear the footsteps. However, they sounded as if they were trying not to be heard, as they were slow and light steps. I could just look out my window and see who it is. However, I did not want to alert them that someone was home, so I kept my cool and waited it out. I nearly pissed myself when I heard the large window being tapped on, very, very slowly, and my adrenaline started to kick in as the knocking slowly turned to rapid banging. What the fuck? I remember saying to myself in a shaky voice. Who in the world would be banging on my lounge window at 12:30 a.m.? Plus, I lived in the middle of nowhere, which really had me on edge. That was when I heard glass shatter, and my heart raced and my eyes widened. Someone was in my fucking house, and I was not going to have them kill me or abduct me. I sprinted to the French doors in my parents' room, opened them and lunged myself out of them, which was about 20 feet high. Thankfully, I wasn't hurt, but I didn't care. The adrenaline was pumping like it was going out of fashion. I made a beeline for the tree line in the woods, hopping the small fence with absolute ease. I hid behind the tree line, and I saw my kitchen light flick on. Shit. I was so petrified, but I needed to calm down. But I couldn't. What if they found me? What if they caught me and tortured me? This isn't happening, I remember spitting out. After I said that, I saw the silhouette of a man in my kitchen, rummaging through the drawers and cupboards. Whilst I was watching him, I realized I had no phone service. That's what happens when you live in a remote area. But then, what I heard freaked me out. I heard twigs snap behind me, and I flicked my head back like a catapult, and there was another man dressed in all black with a balaclava covering his face. It was a lure. They lured me outside to get me. I bolted into the woods, as this man was not far behind me. But then, he rugby tackled me to the ground. I can easily say he was 6'5" and at least 240 pounds, as I couldn't move at all. He was so heavy. What's going on? I shouted in disarray. He gestured and pointed to my house. That, he said in a low and monotone voice, as he pulled out what looked like a Swiss Army knife. My colleague is taking care of your house, he said sadistically, as he started to slowly laugh. I thought it was the end of me. I was shouting and trying my best to move, but to no avail. I had to do something. He was watching the house whilst pinning me down, but my right hand was still able to move a tad. I grabbed the nearest stick subtly and rammed it into his eye socket. Survival mode kicked in as I jammed it deeper and deeper, and his scream was piercing through the woods, as I showed no mercy on this beefy son of a bitch. He eventually lost his grip, and I put his head on the floor and pressed the stick more into his eye. Blood was spraying left and right, but I didn't care, as I had to survive and not get killed. It was either him or me, and it was not going to be me. Whilst doing this, the Lords must have been watching over me, as I somehow got phone service. I called the cops, and they said they would be 20 minutes. 20 goddamn minutes of waiting for the cops. I got the Swiss Army knife the guy had, and plunged it into his foot with all my might, and then bolted into the woods, as I could hear a loud scream from the man I had just stabbed. I decided to run around the woods, and back to the side of the house, so that I could potentially see this man in my house without him seeing me. I went around, and I could see the man from before that I stabbed, still in the same spot, not moving. That made me feel easier, as now 15 minutes had passed by. I could hear extremely faint sirens in the distance. I saw the other guy in my house, but he didn't see me, so I subtly went into the bushes opposite my house, and I could see him calling to the other guy that I had stabbed. "Pete, you there? We need to fucking go. Now," he shouted again. Pete did not respond. He exited the house with the black bags and sprinted down the road. The police arrived, armed and ready to fire, with their guns pointed at the burglar. They arrested him and found the other guy dead. It was closed in self-defense, and I wasn't charged for anything. The guy got put into the police car, and as he did, he stared right at me and said, "You're lucky I didn't slit your pretty little throat," as the cops told him to stay silent. He kept staring though. It was now 1:30 a.m., and I was taken to the police station to write a statement. My parents were informed and cut their holiday short, and were super apologetic for leaving me alone. And the next day, my dad bought a .44 Magnum and a Remington shotgun. We moved out of that house 3 months later. I have never been so scared in my life, and it's amazing what the human body can do under immense stress, pressure, and adrenaline. I honestly thought I was going to die, and had to think irrationally in order to survive. I was 28 years old and I had just been released from prison after 5 years. Eventually, I was loaded into a bus with 2 other men. Fear, excitement, uncertainty, and relief washed over me. In my excitement, I struck up a conversation with a man called Alan. We chit-chatted back and forth about how he was a carpenter and tradesman, and that I was going to college. We spoke about various things: freedom, our first meal, and parole conditions. I couldn't do shit while on parole, because I was considered a high risk, but he had some parole conditions I found odd. One that stuck out to me was not to wear masks or enter the city of Berkeley without the expressed permission of the city chief of police. I laughed at it and figured he had robbed someone, because when you lived around pimps, murderers, rapists, and thieves for about 5 years, that's what you do. We arrived at the parole offices and parted ways. I began a long stream of reintegrating back into society. About 3 months go by and I run into Alan at the parole office. We talk for a second, and I loan him some money, expecting not to get it back. By this time, I was in college and had more money than I knew what to do with, and had my own place. I vaguely told him where I was staying, and he said he'd check it out because he was trying to get out of the halfway house. Again, we parted ways. Now here's where it gets weird. I'm in my apartment playing my Xbox 360, when suddenly I hear a commanding knock on the door. Expecting it to be my parole officer, I immediately jump up and open it. It's Alan, with this lady he introduces to me as his girlfriend. Let's call her Jane. Immediately I ask, "How did you know where I lived?" "Oh, I saw your car parked by the side of the street." Which I just said okay, and let them in. Mind you, I live in an apartment complex, with about 50 other people, so even if he had seen my car, there's no way he would know exactly where I lived. We started talking, and he tells me he needs money, and I'm like, "Hey, help me anchor this TV stand and I'll give you another $20. Call it even on that other 20, and I'll order the pizza." Alan and his girlfriend said sure, and we hung out for a couple of hours. At one point, I felt a little odd about how he knew where I lived, but brushed it aside because any human contact was needed in my current state of lockdown. After the pizza, I felt some sort of tension, like my sixth sense was alerting me. I chalked it up to hanging out with another parolee, and didn't want to get busted by my parole officer. So he and his girlfriend left, and I didn't see them again until nearly a year later. I won't go into detail, but I violated my parole and went back to prison. I was keeping myself occupied by reading papers. I picked up the Detroit Free Press, and the cover story reads, "What's wrong with the Michigan Department of Corrections? Day 3. I read it wondering what type of garbage they have in this article, because I know my intentions are to make a productive citizen out of myself. What I find floors me. Alan is in the article, and his girlfriend, for befriending and murdering an 80-year-old lady, and suspected of more crimes throughout the Detroit metro area. As if that isn't messed up enough, the premise of their motive was to do handiwork for the old lady. I had these 2 people in my house under the same stipulations. Thinking back about how they got my address and just showed up at my place, I have no idea what their intentions were. But one thing I can tell you, I would have never saw it coming. I'm a 6'2", 280-pound 11 Bravo Iraq War veteran that spent 5 years lifting weights in prison. I'm a big-ass dude. Maybe that's why they didn't try anything. Or maybe because I bought them pizza. Who knows? I tuck my kids into bed every night, and occasionally I lie to them when they ask about monsters. I tell them that they're not real. But I know the truth. I fed 2 of them pizza one night in my apartment. On a lighter note, if anybody is wondering, I've been off parole 3 years, just started my own business, married with 3 kids. Freedom fucking rocks. This story takes place about 5 years ago, in North Bend, Oregon, also part of Coos Bay, but Coos Bay's the other end of it. This is actually my own story, it's not written down, so it's going to sound a little different, probably, hopefully, a little more like I actually talk. This is going to be the story about how one of my wife's coworkers disappeared, and still is not found, as well as a different murder, or what they say was an accidental death, leading up to it. And a little bit about the craziness of the apartments I lived in, and some of the shenanigans my neighbors would pull. My wife and I actually met on Facebook through my sister. After a few months of chatting back and forth, we decided to actually meet up. I was actually divorced probably 6 months or a year before that. She was in an abusive relationship, so we figured we'd just go try to start things somewhere else. I went and picked her up in California, and we decided to move to Coos Bay, North Bend, Oregon. 2 different cities, tiny as hell, thrown together. I never know which one's which. I think technically we were in North Bend, but I'm not sure. At the time, my mom was living there. That was the whole reason we moved up there, so I could actually see my family again. So we ended up getting an apartment. I think I paid 2 months rent in advance. I'll try to find a picture of the apartment and put it on the screen now so you can see it. This apartment wasn't very nice. We'll just say that. I guess it was more considered the bad area of town, but we really didn't know. Like literally that one little area. The cops were there all the time. It was ridiculous. So we move in and we're on the 3rd floor. The neighbors next to us have a family and they're all actually pretty cool. And the other one next to us is open. We're kind of in between 2 of them. Paper thin walls. It looks like they took old like college dorms, because it is right across from the college, and split them up to really small. We were in a studio apartment, probably a couple 100 square feet. Like it was tiny, ridiculous tiny. And after the family moved out next to us, we ended up getting some tweakers that moved in there. And then on the other side, we got another old guy that was a tweaker. So then they start sleeping together in exchange for drugs or something. And I get woken up with them stabbing each other all the time. It happened a lot. I'd always be out on my porch having to call the cops because one neighbor stabbed another one. Something over drugs all the time. Or the fights outside. Amazing how I got drug into that. Long story short, they both got evicted. Another neighbor moves in. This guy did no drugs, but he seemed a little off. He'd stop me outside and he'd yell at me for wearing skulls all the time, because all my clothes are pretty dark. They have skulls and everything. I didn't quite understand. I was just like, whatever, dude, and just kind of walked away. And then the cops start showing up at my house all the time. So the cops come up and they're, hey, we got a noise complaint. I was like, well, I'm not doing anything. And then after a while, they'd stop, and there was one time I heard a ruckus out there, and I opened it up. Dude, he called the cops again on me, and the cop didn't even knock on my door. He just starts yelling at him to leave me alone. Needless to say, we lived around some interesting people. My wife worked 2 buildings away. Where we were right next to the Staples parking lot. She worked at Walmart. So she'd have to walk through the Staples parking lot and then to Walmart. But I'd walk her any time it was dark because this place was pretty freaking bad. I don't understand how a tiny little town like that could be so bad. But I guess drugs do a lot to people. So she's working there for a while, and she gets to know this other lady named Glinda. Glinda was a really sweet old lady. I remember meeting her a few times. She was the greeter at Walmart. Everything was fine for probably 6 months or so, besides the cops showing up at our apartment every day for someone within the complex. A little bit more time goes by, and then a young girl from a couple miles down the road disappears. This girl had a little bit of a mental handicap, and I guess what she'd do is she'd walk to Walmart every day, grab her drink, and then walk home. Like it was her daily routine, very strict. One day she just didn't come back from that routine. And she was missing, I want to say she was missing for about a week or 2. And then they finally found her behind the nightclub in the bushes, off of a trail way up in a tiny little creek, face down in the water, and she had drowned. They said it was accidental. I don't know, the family and a lot of us are like, whoa, how does she... It just didn't add up for us. All the stipulations, I didn't see her crawling into the bushes, putting her face in a 1-inch. Like, it was hard to get there. They could barely get her out. So then, not long after that, or right around the same time, Glinda disappears too. The older lady, the greeter from Walmart. At the time, she was living with her son, who had some sort of mental issues as well. He was supposed to be on medication, but I don't think he'd take it. I guess they'd fight a lot, and this night after she got home, supposedly they got in an argument and she left, leaving her phone, her medication because she was diabetic too, and even her glasses, which she needed to see. And it's supposed that she went on a walk and never came back. So the police interview her son, and these are rumors that were floating around town, you know how that is. He had said that the aliens came and took her, and then said that they would find her body in the San Francisco Bay. As far as I know, he wasn't really questioned much more after that, but I can't be certain. Like I said, a lot of this was rumors, except for the fact that she disappeared and the son was the last one to see her alive. It's also stated that a few people could see him out by the grocery store, looking towards the woods and just laughing afterwards. In the couple of weeks following, there were search parties non-stop, from the beach all the way up the bay, and there was still no sign of her. Dogs, the whole community, everyone was out searching, but there was no trace to be found. After a while, they eventually did pronounce her dead and held a memorial service. And to this day, there's still no sign of her, and no one knows what happened. I think the craziest thing for me is to think that it was so close to home, literally and figuratively. It was literally not even a block from where I lived, and it was also so close to home as in it was a really good friend of my wife, as well as my sister. They all knew each other and worked together. So it was really hard on them as well, and my wife still often checks in to try to see if there's been any update. I know it's kind of a stretch, but if any of you are in the Coos Bay, North Bend, Roseburg, any of that area, up around the Douglas County area, or even anywhere along the coast for all I know, if you may have seen this lady at any time, years ago or currently, please make sure to call the investigator's number on the screen. It'd be really nice to have some closure for the family and friends. So hopefully in some way maybe this can get more exposure and we can find out what happened to her. And I know this isn't necessarily a story, it's more of an experience, but I wanted to do it, so I did. I really don't know if it would have been her son, or if it was just a really bad area and she did go on a walk and someone found her, because that happened a lot out there. The crime was really bad in this small area. It had to be the meth. Like meth, I know people say meth is everywhere. Literally meth was everywhere in this city. Like people would smoke it while working at work. Like it was freaking bad. I don't understand it. I'm just hoping in the future there can be some closure, because I know my wife still thinks about her constantly, as well as my sister, and I'm sure her family and friends. I am a female living in the Midwest. Before I get into this, I think a little backstory is needed. We have always lived, not really in the middle of nowhere, but in a rural little cluster of houses directly off a less traveled highway, roughly about 10 minutes from town, and surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides, and a set of very steep train tracks directly behind my house, with another cornfield directly behind that. Most days, being the bored kids we were in the early 2000s, we had nothing else to do other than play outside. No one's parents wanted 8 other kids plus their own running around in their house all day, so most days we climbed over the tracks and would play in the small clearing on the other side right next to where the cornfield would start. This mainly consisted of running around with no parental supervision and swearing anytime the situation allowed, pretending to be Pokemon trainers, and throwing rocks like asshole kids, pretending they were Pokeballs. This was somewhere around 2003 and early 2004, so I would have been about 7 or 8. I don't remember exactly what time of year it was, but there was snow on the ground and it was cold as hell. Like mom bundled you up in everything but the rug kind of cold. I had gone over the tracks with a couple other neighbor kids, which by the way was ridiculously hard, considering I was in 2 coats and a couple pairs of pants and could barely bend my limbs. And when I say these tracks were steep, I mean like you could jump off the top and almost hit the direct bottom. I remember arguing with my mom before I left, because how in the hell was I supposed to run and play like everyone else when I looked like a marshmallow child? Looking back, I'm happy she made me dress for the weather. Otherwise, what happened could have been a lot worse. We were there for about an hour, throwing snowballs, and a few rocks, at each other, when one of the kids, Dylan, decides it would be so fun if he took the sled I had decided to bring and slide down the steep incline of the railroad tracks. This, to me, was the stupidest idea. But I was already one of the least liked kids in our group, and the only reason they let me hang out was because my parents would always buy me the best video game consoles. And I was the first person on my block with a Game Boy Advance. So I decided against saying anything, because I didn't want to be made fun of for being a wimp. The sides of the tracks were covered in very pointy rocks that led into a small group of trees. Bad idea. But I went along with it. I told them I couldn't go down because I wouldn't be able to climb back up with what I was wearing, but I would push them. They agreed, and soon all the dumbass kids, excluding myself, were flying down the side of these tracks and narrowly missing the trees at the bottom. You know that feeling you get when you're a kid, and you're doing something your parents never actually told you not to do, but you still knew they'd be mad if they found out? Yeah. I had a knot in the pit of my stomach just waiting for my mom to appear and start screaming at all of us. After a while of doing this, with no one getting hurt, my nervousness started to go away, and soon I was enjoying pushing everyone else as hard as I could down the incline. I know, kids are weird. Finally, after the last kid came back up, we all decided to go home since it was getting cold, and it was starting to get dark. The kid I mentioned earlier, Dylan, being the little prick he was, decided that I couldn't have my sled back unless I went down the hill at least once. Since I didn't have to climb back up after I went down, I agreed. Although, I wasn't really comfortable with it. In fact, I was terrified. But the need to seem cool to other kids when you're young is ridiculous, and soon I was sitting on the sled waiting for my push. I held on to the sides of the sled until my knuckles turned white and was ready to go. Dylan comes up behind me, put one foot on the sled, and pushes me hard by my shoulders. Instead of shooting off down the incline like the other kids, my sled stayed in place. But I did not. No, I flew off the front and started rolling head over feet, getting jabbed and poked by the rocks coating the side of the tracks. I remember smacking the side of my forehead near my temple on a large rock wedged beneath a fallen tree branch, and that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital early the next morning with a bandage wrapped over one eye and circling to the back of my head, like you would see in a war movie. My left eye socket was broken, along with multiple lacerations on my face from being cut by rocks while falling. I also had the beginning stages of frostbite on my nose and ears. My mom was sitting in the recliner next to me, talking to my dad quietly on the phone about pressing charges. I was later informed that after Dylan had purposely pushed me down the side of the tracks, he told the other kids, several of whom were his brothers and sisters, that if they told anyone he would beat them up. So they all went home as it got dark, and left me knocked out at the bottom of the incline with a bleeding forehead and my bare face halfway submerged in the snow. When my dad came looking for me, he went to the other kids' houses and eventually, after threatening to call the police when they kept telling him different stories, they admitted that Dylan had pushed me down the side of the tracks, and that's where I still was. My mom told me several years later that when my dad found me, he originally thought I was dead because my face was cold and blue and covered in blood. He ran home carrying me, threw me in the back seat of the car, and sped the whole way to the hospital, not stopping for a single red light. When he got to the hospital, they literally had to cut me out of my multiple layers of clothing, and the doctor told my mom that if I hadn't been so well bundled, I could have easily frozen to death. I made a full recovery with only a few minor scars on the upper left side of my face. Nothing happened to Dylan, because he was only around 8 or 9 at the time, and before spring came, his whole family moved out of the neighborhood. My parents did end up suing his parents, but we barely got enough to cover the hospital bills. So, that's the story how I almost died trusting some asshole kid. And if anyone was wondering, I was no longer allowed to have anything to do with any of the kids in the neighborhood again, aside from the ones who weren't there. I was also never allowed to go near the train tracks again. The person who submitted this next story did also submit a news article, but they asked me not to make that public, since it's a small town they live in. This story is a pretty deep story, and it does refer to sexual assault. If you want to comment on this story, make sure you keep it clean. I am a female and I live in a decent area. Not too bad, not too good. Safe, but not safe, if that makes sense. People could walk outside at night and early in the morning, and almost nothing would happen. Almost. Quick backstory. My mom and I never had much money. She couldn't really drive me to school because it was hard for her to wake up in the morning. So to make things easier for her, I would walk to school. I live about 1 through 1.5 hours away from my school, so I would wake up at about 5 to leave around 5:30 in the morning and get to school in time to dry off from the sweat and to do early studying just in case. Judge me all you want, but unless you've grown up with nothing, you wouldn't understand me and my family's struggle. So now to the main story. I was 16 years old. I walked to and from school a good 2 years since I started high school. The way I would walk to school was kind of complicated. This journey would take a good chunk out of my morning, but I loved the morning fresh air. I kind of lived near the ocean, so I could smell a nice breeze when I got to school, see the stars, and enjoy my time before having to socialize. Well, this morning, unfortunately, didn't go so smooth. So I started making my way to school, and passed my apartments and made my way to the alley. All of a sudden, a black car with tinted windows pulled up next to me, and some guy wearing pantyhose on his head pointed a gun in my direction. I was able to see through the pantyhose, and I saw how mean his eyes were. I don't remember the man anymore except his eyes. He pointed a gun in my direction and said, "You, give me all the money you have." I didn't know how to respond, so I just put my hands up, looked at him and said, "I just have $1 on me. If you want that, go ahead." He got out of the car and started to frisk me, still pointing the gun in my direction. He then opened the back seat of his car and told me to get in on my stomach. Because I didn't know what to do, I did as he asked. He then told me to interlock my fingers behind my back, so I did as he said. He then suddenly bound my hands together and then got something to cover my eyes. I'm not sure exactly what he used to cover my eyes, but I feel like he used the pantyhose on his face to tie my hands. Its stretched out fibers dug into my arms as I laid in the back seat. "If you do anything, I won't hesitate to kill you." He drove for a really long time. I'm not sure of how long, but he did stop frequently at what I believe were stoplights. At one stop, he braked so hard that I fell in between where your feet go in the seat. He just laughed it off and started talking to me while driving. "So what's your name?" I told him. "What's your age?" 16. "What grade?" 10th. Afterwards, he just went quiet, and an awkward air just went around us. I was really confused on why he kept asking questions, but I thought that maybe if I got on a human level with him, he would let me live. After a long time driving, I heard my phone go off. My friends would usually call me if they noticed that I'm not around at a certain time. They called a good 2 or 3 times before I didn't hear my phone go off anymore. "Your friends?" "Yeah, they always call me when they don't see me at school." "Why?" "Why?" I kinda laughed a bit at this. Because friends care about each other. It's human nature. Another moment of silence before he stops the car. I heard him get out of the car, and I heard a lot of typical background noises. Buses, cars, people doing typical chattering. I was hoping at this point that I was in a free zone. I heard the back door open, and I suddenly felt a cold line on the back of my leg. I heard the tearing and cutting of clothes as my butt felt the cold morning breeze. I felt like I had tunnel hearing. I just heard the scissors cutting and the clothes tearing. After he stopped tearing my clothes off, he propped me up in the back seat and started to sexually assault me. I don't know how long it was, but I did black out while it happened. I felt him hit my head and tell me to get the fuck up. I got out of the car, still naked mind you, and followed him. He said to get on my knees and don't look back or he will shoot. I heard the trunk open and he threw clothes at me. Here, take these. He cut whatever he tied my hands with and started making his way back to his car. I heard the car door close and the engine start. The heat of the car backed off, and suddenly I felt cold air. I sat there for maybe a good 10 minutes before I took off the blindfold, the morning light hurting my eyes. Then it took another minute for me to comprehend that I was in an open apartment parking garage. I looked at my hands, and they were slightly cut with, you guessed it, the stocking the asshat was wearing. Next to me were clothes. I think it was a really big sweater and small pants. I put them on in a hurry and ran the hell out of the garage. I ran up to the first apartment and started knocking, but no one answered. I saw across the street that there was a mailman entering the apartment, so I ran across a busy street and tried to find the mailman. I couldn't see him, so I started knocking on a random door and cried for help. Fortunately, a man opened the door and looked at me in shock. I just told him a very hurried story of me being kidnapped and that I needed to use his phone. He told me to stay right there, and he grabbed his phone. The first thing I did was call my mom. I know it sounds stupid, but she's the only one I could think of in that moment. She heard me crying, and I told her what happened. She was mortified to hear that her daughter was abducted and raped. She talked to the guy for a second, and he said that he was going to call 911. He let me in, sat me on his couch, offered me some water, and walked around his apartment. I felt kind of bad for him, because you don't expect to wake up to a random girl at your door asking for help. I looked at the time and noticed that it was about 7:30 or 8ish. This was 8 years ago. Sorry if I'm not that specific. A couple of minutes in, and funny thing, my mom got to this guy's house before the police. Seeing her, I broke down. I cried like a little bitch after the realization came in. She stayed with me and the guy until the police came in. The typical, what did he look like, what car did he drive, all that fun stuff. But all in all, the police were really nice. They needed to take me to the hospital to get some samples for DNA from that asshat. But before I left, I wholeheartedly thanked the guy and followed the officers to the hospital. The afterwards of the day doesn't really matter because police inquiries are really boring, but I was able to stay home for the day. My mom wanted to know if I wanted to take a week off, but instead I went to school because I really wanted to hang around with friends. When I went to school, everyone knew. It was a small school, so rumors go around fast. The teachers felt so bad for my mom, but they tried their best to console her. Afterwards, my mom started dropping me off at school. She didn't want me to walk to school ever again after what happened. The police never found out who did it. They caught his car on surveillance camera, but no other leads, unfortunately. When this happened, it felt bad at first, because I thought it was my fault. But now thinking back on it, I didn't do anything wrong. I've since become stronger from this. I know that may sound weird, but friends and family do help you in your time of need. I grew up in this very small Midwestern community out in the middle of the country. It was really an awesome place to grow up in because of the environment. Woods and creeks surrounded the whole area, and growing up there, I spent a lot of time out in these woods. This area I grew up in was rumored to be haunted because of the old cemetery that was at the edge of this town. But this is not what the story is about. It was around 2001. I was about 16 at the time. It was right around the beginning of October, and my next door neighbor, who was around 10 or so at the time, was having a Halloween/birthday party, and he had several other kids from his grade. As part of the festivities, they were planning on taking a hayride through the woods. I thought it would be fun to try and scare them while they were on this ride, so as they were about to leave, I slipped away and went down to the woods. It was about 9:30 p.m. at this time, and it was very dark outside. I made my way into the woods and decided I was going to hide under the side of the large bridge that crossed the creek, so I climbed down the rail and stood on the cement platform below to wait. I had been waiting in this spot for around 10 minutes. I was watching for the truck's headlights to come down the road so I could get into position. As I'm watching down the road, I see a man walk out of the woods and onto the side of the road. I couldn't tell exactly what he was doing, as he was probably 75 feet or so away from me, and it was really dark in the woods at night. I found it odd that the guy didn't have a flashlight or anything, but then again, neither did I. After about 20 seconds or so, the guy turned around and walked back into the woods. I didn't think he had seen me because I had been in my location for a good 10 minutes before I ever saw him. I didn't feel too threatened either, because in order to get to me, he would have to cross a bridge or the water to sneak up on me. I stayed in my spot for another couple of minutes and watched the area where the guy went back into the woods. I never did see any light, and he soon disappeared deeper into the woods. After a few minutes, I decided it would probably be best to get out of there. I quietly climbed out from under the bridge and made my way out of the woods and back to the party. I didn't think anyone else had gone out there to scare the kids besides me. I clearly saw the silhouette of this man, and his appearance was much different than anyone else's at the party. Tall and decently built. When I got back, I asked my neighbor's parents if anyone else was out in the woods trying to scare the kids during the hayride, and they said no. When the kids returned, I asked the guy driving the truck about it, and he saw no such person. So, I just saw a man walk out of the dark woods, only to re-enter it. It was creepy, but I never felt like I was in much danger, as I'm pretty sure he never saw me. So a couple of days later, I'm out in the woods with a buddy from down the street, during the daytime though this time. We were near the area where I saw this guy, and we find this post that had been buried in the ground, and on top of it are 3 animal skulls. They are large skulls too, appearing to be that of a dog or a possible deer. The post was in the center of a star with a circle made around it from animal bones. Clearly someone had spent some time building this, but it gets even scarier. A short ways up from the post was a dead goat. It had a rope tied around its neck and its throat had been slit. My friend and I knocked down the post and left. While it was obviously a very disturbing thing to find, I guess we didn't think much of it, because this area had its fair share of oddities because of the rumors about it being haunted, and we assumed it was just people trying to scare people and create a good story. Now jump ahead a few weeks. I was usually out at night a fair amount. My friend and I like to ride our bikes around the streets at night and talk. And on this particular night, we noticed a group of 4 people walking around the streets. They were wearing all black. We acknowledged them, but they didn't say anything back. It was odd, but whatever. We saw them a couple other times that week too, just being creepers. Now here's the scariest part of all, and I need to be completely honest. I can't remember if this event was the same week or if it was a couple weeks later after we saw these people on the streets, but I know it was around this time because my friend moved away shortly after this happened, and I know it was closely related to this time period. My friend was the oldest of 6 kids, and he had a sister who was 12 at the time, who shared a bedroom with her 3-year-old sister. One night at around 2 or 3 in the morning, she heard a noise by the doorway of their bedroom. She rolled over to look, and standing in the doorway was a guy wearing all black. She started screaming and the guy immediately took off. Her parents' bedroom was directly across the hall from hers, and they came. When they went into the living room, the front door was wide open. Someone had definitely been in their house. They looked outside, but couldn't find anyone. I assume they slipped into a nearby house or the woods, which was a short distance away. I don't know their intent, but I have a pretty good idea. I know there was a cult activity that went on out there in the woods. Thankfully, she heard that noise and looked over before it was too late. There's unsolved disappearances all over the world. Some of them make big news, like Madeleine McCann, the Sodder children, or Lars Matank, so the whole world knows about them. But some of those unsolved disappearances are lesser known. My best friend from when I was a child is such a case. I'm a 19-year-old female, and this all started about 8 years ago. Like many 11-year-old girls, I had a best friend, who we will call Clara. We spent a lot of time together, had lots of inside jokes, you know, typical best friends. One day Clara didn't come to school. At first, I thought she might simply be sick, but when she didn't come back for multiple days, I started to get worried, so I decided to call her to ask what was wrong. But she didn't pick up her phone, neither her cell phone nor her house phone. When I told my mom about it, she was concerned as well. She's a nurse at the local hospital, where Claire's mother worked as a chairwoman. She told me that Claire's mother hadn't been to work in a few days either, after she had called in and said that she had the flu. My mother thought that maybe Claire's mom had passed the flu on to Clara, and now they were both sick. She agreed, however, on going over to check on them, in case they needed help. Clara's mom's car was in the driveway, but all of the blinds were rolled down. When my mom rang the doorbell, she couldn't hear a single sound inside. Clara had a dog that was very protective, so the fact that he wasn't barking struck both of us as odd. We then started asking around, but no one had heard from Clara or her mother in almost a week. Not even Clara's dad, who lived 2 towns over. After a few more days, my mom decided to report them as missing. Another week passed, and Clara came back to school, but she was not the girl she had been 2 weeks ago. She was skinny, had bruises everywhere, and that empty, 1,000-yard stare. She never told me what happened. As a matter of fact, she never told me or anyone else anything. She barely spoke and completely secluded herself from the outside world. As the years went on, it became more and more obvious that Clara was struggling with multiple issues. She was obviously battling an eating disorder and started cutting by the time she was 13. She would frequently miss days or even weeks at school. Our friendship pretty much died, but I couldn't help but care about her. She had no other friends, so I would text her our homework whenever she missed school. But then, when I was 16, Clara called me one night. She was completely hysterical and told me her mother had just been submitted to a mental institution. Upon asking her why, she told me that her mother had developed an obsession with Christianity and the Bible and had been convinced that both herself and Clara had demons lurking inside of them. She then told me about her mother trying to exorcise her, sometimes for hours on end, how she would beat her and let strangers try to cast the demons out of both of them. I listened in horror as Clara was telling me all of this. I asked her if I should come over, but she just told me that she wasn't home right now and refused to tell me where she was. The call ended very abruptly, and she wouldn't pick up her phone after that. She wasn't at school the next day. This wasn't unusual, but it still worried me. I tried to call her, but her phone was turned off, so I decided to check on her. But when I got to her house, I found that it was empty. And I mean empty. I looked through the windows and all the furniture had vanished. There was no trace of Clara. I reported her as missing, but nothing ever came of it. I periodically call the police for updates, but they haven't found anything. I don't know the details of what Clara's mom did to her, but I am sure as how glad she's locked up, and I hope she never sees her again. As for Clara, wherever you might be, I hope you are alive and well. This happened about 3 years ago. I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment at the time with my husband. After finally moving to the United States, I'm Canadian, and marrying, it was our first home to ourselves, where we would be together all the time. We had been doing long distance for 3 years before that, and as my husband is in the military, sometimes it would be extra long distances on his deployments. At this time, I was about 6 months pregnant, and my husband was gone to a temporary duty station a few states away for a few months, leaving me alone in a new city and a new country. My sister was sweet enough to come and visit me and keep me company during the time he was gone. It was wonderful to have company. I felt much safer with someone I knew there. Our tiny 2-bedroom apartment was on the ground floor. One bedroom had been set up for our baby girl, with a crib, chair, and all of that. The other bedroom was ours, so my sister just bunked with me on our queen-size bed while she visited, to prevent her from sleeping on our uncomfy couch. It had been about a week into her visit, and after doing some shopping and relaxing, my sister decided to hit the hay. I finish up cleaning, lock the apartment, and go to sleep too. The setup to our apartment was a little like this. There was a front door you could access through the hallway, which opened into our kitchen to the right and our laundry room on the left. This was also connected to our living room, so it was a wide open space. The nursery was off to the left, our bedroom off to the right, and we had a sliding glass door at the back of the living room that opened to a small concrete patio and some grass. It was about 4 a.m., and being extremely rotund, I was a light sleeper. I had been tossing and turning and awoke to a light shining in my face. I cracked open my eyelid and shot up immediately with a scream. There, in my bedroom doorway, was a lady, no older than about 25, standing in pajama pants and a bra, hair in a black messy bun. Strangely enough, she was also holding one of my empty laundry baskets. The door was open and the kitchen lights were blaring into my room. My sister sat up and said, "Oh my God!" My hand reflexively went to my belly. I think I probably peed myself a little, out of terror and pregnancy. I didn't have a gun or a knife around, so I sat there fat and helpless and terrified. The girl took a step back and stammered, I think I'm in the wrong apartment. Sorry. My sister takes medications to help her sleep, and she was kind of out of it, and being Canadian doesn't help. "Oh, it's okay. Yeah, it's okay," she said, and went back to sleep. Right back to sleep. The girl backed up and immediately sprinted out of my apartment through my front door, only in her bra, and still holding my damn laundry basket. I sat there frozen for a good 15 minutes as the light from the sunrise started filling my room. Then suddenly, I picked up the phone, bursting into tears, and called my husband. I explained the situation to him, too afraid to get out of bed. I woke up my sister in an angry, terrified manner, asking her why the hell she told that girl it was okay that she was in my home, and that she was just sleeping. She sheepishly said she was a little sedated and was out of it. Well, sleepy my ass, you're gonna get up and help my fat ass waddle around the apartment and make sure it's all clear. We walk out into the living room, and the back sliding door is wide open, with cool morning air billowing in. This is how she got in the apartment. I close it and pull the lock on it, and give it a few tugs. It opens after a strong pull. Well, that explains it. I walk around the apartment, and when I get to the baby's room, a strange sight appeared. Some of the baby's clothes were on the floor, her dresser drawers open and clothes scattered, and there was a tiny black bra on the floor. My sister and I were certainly not A-cups, so this wasn't ours. After checking through her suitcase, we realized that our intruder had taken off her bra and put on my sister's bra. There was also no shirt to be found, so we have no idea whether she entered the apartment without a shirt or not. And finally, the clothes I had folded in my laundry basket on top of the dryer had been dumped on the floor. None of the clothes were taken, but the basket was gone. I opened our front door and peeked into the hallway, and no basket was there. My sister and I concluded that this must have been some drunk there was a bar around the corner of my apartment, or a strung-out girl who had wandered in. I called that morning and reported it to the landlord, and got them to replace the back lock. I'm a 26-year-old woman living in a large Midwestern American city. I moved to the city about 4 years ago from the East Coast, leaving everything I knew behind after marrying my husband. I had graduated from college, gotten married, and moved 500 miles away from home, all in the span of 2 months. I was excited to live together with my husband after a 2-year long-distance relationship. It was the most logical sense for me to move to his state, as he was established in a trade in the city. Being newly married and starting over in a brand new city, money was scarce, even with both of us working full-time. We lived in a 700 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment in a notoriously poor and potentially dangerous part of town. Think miles and miles of asphalt, abandoned businesses, and malls with apartment complexes built in the 70s scattered throughout the area. Apartments were packed in close, with usually less than 50 yards between each unit building. One night around 3 a.m., my husband and I awoke to someone pounding hard on the front door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I went to meet the knocking. A fully uniformed fireman informed me quickly that the building next door was on fire, and we needed to evacuate our apartment immediately. I gave him my thanks, and ran inside to inform my husband and gather our 2 newly adopted kittens in their carrier. We made it out without much fuss, and were moved a safe distance away, with our building by the road, a center building and a third building in view. The center building burst with gray smoke, but we didn't see any flames. That was comforting. We checked on the status of some of the other evacuated people, but no one knew anything. After about half an hour, the emergency responders told us everything was safe and that we could go back to our respective buildings, adjacent to the one still smoking. The 2 fire trucks and 4 police cars were gone by the time we woke up the next morning. Typical of our apartment complex, we heard nothing about the incident following that night, though we had been told that an officer would be visiting soon. After a week, we figured out that it was only one apartment in the center building of 4 that fire severely damaged. However, that single unit was completely destroyed. From what we could see, the fire gutted the apartment, but caused no significant external damage to the building. We didn't know who lived there, as the general atmosphere of the complex didn't lend itself to friendliness. Broken glass peppered the tiny patch of grass outside the building's door. We continued our lives for another week or so. Soon, strange things began to occur inside and outside of our apartment. When we would walk to our cars in the parking lot, we smelled something disgusting. It was a rotten, pervasive smell that became so bad we had to walk out of our way to avoid it. We thought it was garbage or debris from the charred apartment, which remained mostly untouched. Inside our unit, our 2 cats began batting at and catching all types of insects, mostly flies and a few that crawled. Autumn had arrived, bringing cold weather, so we were unsure why the bugs were hanging around so long. We chalked it up to bad apartment construction and ceiling issues. About a month after the night of the fire, we awoke one morning to a call from my father-in-law. He asked us if we were all right. "What do you mean?" my husband said. "They found a body in your apartment complex," my father-in-law responded. We told him we were okay, and immediately took to the local TV stations and the internet. Reports were coming in that human remains had been found in the apartment that had been destroyed by the fire. Later, we stepped outside to reveal yellow caution tape surrounding that center building. Police sequestered the entire lot for investigation. News vans and camera crews zoomed up as they were permitted, and even waited outside the complex near the busy highway to get closer to the developing story. We continued to search for information, as again we received no information from the apartment complex or law enforcement on what had actually occurred. All of the details we discovered about the fire and the subsequent discovery of the body were obtained indirectly through news resources in small bits. The horror of realizing that we had been living only 100 yards away from a decomposing corpse struck us in a disorienting blow. The horrible smell, the bugs, all of it because of the body that had languished there for a month, stinking and forgotten. Additionally, the police showed up to investigate because the small immigrant family living upstairs in the center building called the leasing office to report an awful smell. Our stomachs flipped over. My husband, a butcher by trade, had to be sent home from work that day because he had been vomiting when trying to work with the raw meat. We didn't sleep well for months after that. Slowly, we came across more details about the incident. The same day that the fire occurred, the tenant of the burnt apartment had reported her boyfriend missing. The body the police found in the apartment was later identified as Darren Anderson, her boyfriend. It took an inordinately long time to identify the body, as it was badly burned. We had no idea who the tenant was, and didn't know where she went after the fire. Her whereabouts were never reported. The police and fire departments faced heavy scrutiny at their apparent negligence, as it was suggested that the man died the night of the fire. However, the articles I've attached in the description indicate that his cause of death was not determined. I just have so many questions. How did the police and fire department not discover an adult man's body in an apartment so small? Our apartment was identical in layout to the burnt apartment. There was very little storage space, and nowhere to really hide anything, let alone a body. Is there a correlation between his apparent disappearance and death? What role did the female tenant, his alleged girlfriend, play in the incident? Why did the apartment complex hardly enter the apartment to clean or repair the immolated unit in the month following the fire? As far as I can tell, it was all ruled accidental. We still don't even know the cause of the fire. We sent a letter to the leasing office indicating that their negligence in cleaning and investigating the apartment violated the terms of our lease. They responded that we should get a lawyer if we wanted to break our contract, and at that point, we couldn't afford one. We stayed there for almost 2 more years, moving in 2 other separate units on the property. The second apartment had a closet full of black mold. In 2015, we finally left and moved into a better part of town. But I think about that fire and the smell often, and I still have so many questions. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to yourmaker6260@gmail.com. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.